Hello, I'd like to talk to you today about two different things which I feel are completely interrelated: assessment and differentiation. I don't believe that one without the other is basically useless. Right? If we are not using our assessments, then we cannot differentiate. If we're not differentiating, then our assessments are useless. So let's begin with the needs for assessments, right? Why do we need to assess our students? Why do we need to assess our kids? Is because if you look at the very first thing, it says formative assessments is critically important for student learning. Without informative feedback on what they do, students will have relatively little by which to chart their development. This is from York 2003. So the questions asked is, why do we assess our students? Well, because they need feedback, right? They need to know what they're doing right now is working. How are they studying? Whatever it may be. They need to know if that's working. They also need to know, where are their weaknesses? Where are their strengths? We as teachers as well need to know, what are our students' strengths and weaknesses? Right? Only whenever we know these things, only whenever students and teachers both have this information, can a student be successful. Can the student-teacher relationship ever be successful? That's the only way that we can help our kids to succeed, is if we help them to identify where they are either really good in this subject, or maybe this is maybe what you're struggling with, right? And so this helps them to see a clearer picture. Right. A study by Shute et al. Says that regular formative assessments could raise student performance by 0.4 to 0.447 of a standard deviation. Well, this raises the questions. Well, how often should we assess our kids? What kind of assessments are we giving? Right? Are we giving formative? Are we giving summative? Are we providing feedback? How are we using the assessments to make decisions? I personally believe that we should assess our students every single day. This does not necessarily mean we should be giving a formative or summative assessment every day. Maybe we should just be asking them questions, trying to figure out what it is they know. We should be constantly assessing our students to determine their strengths and weaknesses, to determine if what I am doing right now as a teacher is working, right? Formative assessments, though, I believe should be given frequently, right? They should be given a lot more often probably than what many teachers do. But often the reason why teachers don't want to do this is because it becomes a little bit of a burden. It becomes overwhelming to give a formative assessment every single day or every other day, because then you have to grade the papers. Then you have to set up the tests, right? You have to give the test. You have to give time in your class to give it, which is why software which would allow us to do this more efficiently is absolutely needed, right? With the right type of assessment formats, this could be very easily alleviated. All right. The aforementioned study by Shute et al. Does not mention the reason why student performance goes up, but I personally believe that the reason why student performance goes up whenever they're given formative assessments more frequently is because they're given more frequent feedback. Teachers are given more frequent feedback. We are able to adjust our strategies the more current our data becomes. Right? We're more able to identify our students' strengths and weaknesses the more that we assess them, the more that we ask them questions, the more that we find out what they know, we're able to assess their strengths and weaknesses. So the more current our data, again, the better our decisions. This brings us to our last question, though. How are we using the data? Because if we are collecting data for no reason other than just to collect data, well, then we're just wasting our time. If we're not using our data to change our instructional strategies, if we're not using our data to help our students identify their own strengths and weaknesses, to be able to give strategies to overcome those strengths and weaknesses, right, or maybe to improve their strengths, right, then again, we're wasting our time. Okay, this leads us to differentiation. According to Saban, 2006, differentiation is a philosophy of teaching that is based on the premise that students learn best when their teachers accommodate their differences in their readiness levels, interests, and learning profiles, and the use of such strategies can increase test scores. So how do we determine readiness level? For whom do we differentiate? How do we differentiate? Right? Before differentiation can take place, we have to know our students. Right? We have to know them on a personal level, and we also have to know them academically. Well, the only way that we know them academically is we need to assess our students. Again, I go back to the fact that these two topics are interrelated, right? This stems back to assessments and their importance. Who should we differentiate? For all students, right? We should be differentiating for every student in our classroom, whether they're the best student in our class or the worst student in our class. They should all be being taught at a level that is appropriate for them. And again, the only way that we can do this is to assess our students to find out what they know. So how do we differentiate? Well, this largely depends on what kind of student you have or the student that you're dealing with. We cannot have one blanket differentiation strategy and say, well, this is how we're going to do it for every kid, because that's not going to work. The soul and the heart and soul of differentiation is the fact that we have to individualize the education for our students. Only then can they be successful. Only then can they find the meaning in what they're doing, is if we give them a way to make education personal for them, right? So when academic tasks were poorly matched to students' readiness levels, impacts were negative. When students were asked to do tasks for which they did not have requisite skills, both their achievement and feelings of self-worth decreased. When students were asked to do tasks that were too simple for their skill levels, they disengaged with the task. This is from a study by Tomlinson et al. In 2013. So this is basically the idea of teaching to the middle. Oftentimes, students become confused. They become bored. It says it right here in the study. Whenever teachers teach the middle, and they try to use one teaching strategy for all students. This is basically a recipe for failure. We're not helping our students because we're not appropriately identifying their strengths, their weaknesses, and giving them a way to be able to overcome the weaknesses and be able to take advantage of the strengths, right? Again, this goes back as well to knowing our students, knowing their different learning styles and how they learn best. Okay, so some tools to consider whenever we talk about differentiating and assessment are GAFE, or Google Apps for Education, Elluminate, and GoFormative. Google Apps for Education provides a lot of different tools, right? It provides Classroom, an online place where we can put assessments, where we can put assignments, where we can put different documents, right? It allows us to use Google Docs with our kids, which is basically a word processor, right? But it also allows us to provide feedback to our students. It gives teachers access to Google Sheets where they can store data and look for trends. It gives teachers access to Google Forms where they can provide assessments for students, where they can tie standards to these assessments and look at the data, right? Elluminate is an online testing software, right, which allows us, or a testing program, which allows students to create their own exam, or teachers to create their own exams, to create exams from an item bank. And it allows us to see reports that give us an idea of how our students are doing on the standards. It allows us to identify strengths and weaknesses as far as the standards are concerned for each individual student. GoFormative is very similar to Elluminate in that it allows us to upload our own assessments. It allows us to track data, but it also adds the extra benefit of having an online community of teachers available, right, where we have access to their assessments as well. Right. My suggestion would be to use Google Apps for Education, just because I believe that allows us to most adequately assess and differentiate for our students, because we can do quizzes with Google Forms like this, where we can create a quiz based on the standards that we're doing. And it also gives us the data for all of our students, right? We can see the scores, we can see the information, right? Google Sheets allows us to track data for our students and allows us to look for trends, right? Google Classroom, which I personally believe is the greatest strength of this, allows us to create assignments and assessments for each of our individual students. We can create a document, we can create an assignment, and we can assign it to one individual student, we can assign it to all. And the great strength of this is the fact that we'll say I have 5 kids who are struggling with supply and demand. Well, I can send a copy of a remediation video maybe, or whatever it may be, to us to best suit their learning style, and I can give it to only those 5 students, while the other students in the class may be struggling with something else, or maybe they're even great at something else. I can give them a way to strengthen their strengths and maybe be able to help support their weaknesses a little bit more. But my suggestion would be to use Google Apps for Education, because again, I believe that it allows us to both assess our students and differentiate for our students. These are the resources from which my research came. Thank you very much for your time.